Okay, Thomas Freed, taxfreedom.com, and we're back here to do part 2 of our examination of the federal income tax. And let's real quickly review what we did in part 1. We looked at the constitutional powers to tax, both by direct taxation under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, where the tax must be apportioned to the states for payment according to the census. We looked at the power to tax indirectly, which includes the power to tax exported goods by duty, foreign activity by impost, and commodities, licenses, and corporations by excise. We saw that we have the original enabling and necessary enforcement clause, the original necessary and proper enabling enforcement clause, which authorizes Congress at the constitutional level to write law to enforce the taxing powers granted. We saw that the direct taxes never touch the American people, and indirect taxes must be uniform, and Congress is authorized to enforce all 4 types of tax: direct apportioned taxes and uniform impost, duty, and excise. That enforcement power is particularly important because if the court can't be shown an authority that Congress was given by the Constitution to write law for the power allegedly serving as the foundation for the claim that tax is owed, then subject matter jurisdiction of the federal court is missing. Subject matter jurisdiction requires 3 elements. The power to tax must be granted, and an enabling enforcement clause must give Congress the authority to write law to enforce the power to tax in number 1, and then being empowered and able to write law, Congress must actually do so and write a law that enables the tax and makes it enforceable at law through additional statutes written by Congress because they're authorized by the Constitution to enforce the power granted. Okay, so this just explains the original powers in the Enabling Enforcement Clause, and that left us with an understanding of the jurisdictional authority of the courts to enforce tax against the American people as impost, duty, and excise, and it couldn't be anything else because no other powers are granted or made enforceable that reach the American people with legal effect. Direct taxes go to the state governments. Saw that none of these powers, impost, duty, or excises, impost on foreigners, duty on exports, excise on commodities, corporations, none of these taxes reach the American people's right to work with legal effect. So there's no personal jurisdiction over the person to charge them with Article 1 taxation unless they're involved with alcohol, tobacco, firearms, import or export activities, or are working in a territory or possession or possibly some other foreign place, like in a foreign country under tax treaty maybe. Okay, so previous to the 16th Amendment, there is no authority to tax the people's right to work. Didn't exist, never happened, wasn't done. Income tax, on the other hand, did exist. It just wasn't an income tax as we know it. It was a tax on income derived by the corporate person or the other privileged person, where income was the measure of the amount. It wasn't actually the subject of taxation. The subject of the taxation is the privilege, subject to the excise power to tax. How much tax is owed? Well, we're going to measure it by income, which is defined as the profit after expenses are deducted from earnings. And it's only the profit derived from the excise taxable activity. So if you were an individual and you had one job working at the supermarket, another job owning a liquor store, who probably wouldn't be working at the supermarket, but hypothetically, you wouldn't owe money on the money earned at the supermarket because that's done by right, but you would owe income tax on the money derived from the license to sell alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. So all the money derived from selling alcohol under the license would be taxable, but other sources are not. Impost, duty, excise. These are the only fundamental powers to tax that exist, that have ever existed, that still exist today, that were made enforceable at law by an enabling enforcement clause that applies to the powers granted. We then saw that the 16th Amendment doesn't contain the word direct, doesn't have an enabling enforcement clause, and that Congress isn't authorized to write law under this amendment as an alleged source of power or authority. The word direct isn't here. Not here. The only way to interpret this as granting direct action is to add words to it out of your interpretive opinion. You're not allowed to add words. You got to interpret what's there. And if you add the word direct, you create the inherent, irreconcilable conflict with the previous unrepealed and unamended provisions that all direct taxes be apportioned. This was never changed. So, part one, we saw how the Constitution was originally set up. We saw that the 16th Amendment doesn't do anything at all that can happen in the courts. In fact, the only people that the 16th Amendment applies to are the judges of the federal courts, because this says that they can no longer use a source argument as the basis for a finding that the tax law being tested by them is unconstitutional because of the source taxed, which is what they ruled in 1896 in the Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust case, 1896. They ruled you can't, what they ruled is a tax on rent earned by corporations is unconstitutional because rent streams from property, and therefore, because of the source taxed property, it's a direct tax that isn't apportioned to the states for payment and therefore can't be sustained. So you can't tax rent streaming from property because of the source taxed. And this 16th Amendment says the judges can't make that ruling again. You can't say it's a direct tax because of the source taxed. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes from whatever source derived. You can no longer claim the source is the problem. Now, personally, I think they made a bad decision in that Pollock case because I've never seen a piece of property or heard of a piece of property in my life paying rent. The rent wasn't paid by the property. The revenue didn't stream from the property. It streamed from a third-party tenant's use of the commodity. The tenant was leasing the land and growing crops on it and depleting the commodity by growing crops. You have to rotate the crops and replenish them or it becomes worthless land. All the nutrients burned up. Now, a tenant's leasing of the land, which is a commodity, is straight up the alley of legitimate excise taxation. This was never a direct tax on the property. It was an indirect tax on the tenant's payments of the lease of the commodity. Oh, I don't know why they went there. They screwed it all up. And then the liberals, the Fabians of the early 19th century, went nuts and spent 20 years to get this passed. So now the judges can't use the source argument, but Congress can't write any law because there's no enabling enforcement clause. So it does nothing. It does nothing that affects the American people. This is why for 100 years, the myth, supposed myth, that the tax is voluntary has survived. Because if you tell me I owe the tax allegedly because of the 16th Amendment, well, the minute you say that, I know it has to be voluntary. Because there can't be a law under the amendment. Congress isn't authorized by an enabling enforcement clause to write one. Subject matter jurisdiction in the court can't be established. That means if it is a direct tax, the court can't enforce it. Therefore, it has to be voluntary. The IRS can go out there and lie to people and try to get them to pay it and file and pay, but the court can't enforce it because it's not a source of authority that's enforceable at law. Can't be done. You can't get the from here. And then we looked and saw that the actual piece of legislation Congress wrote was a tariff act. Tariff is an impost. That's indirect taxation. That's not a direct tax. Why did the government think it was direct? And we saw that in the legislation, State and United States are redefined to include only the territories Alaska, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands, when necessary, when such construction is necessary to carry out its provisions. In other words, for enforcement purposes, it's limited to a territorial act, because a tariff is an impost which taxes foreign activity and in foreign places, and these are the foreign places it taxes, territories and possession, not in the 50 states. In the 50 states, it's a tax that's collected, and the Bruce-Shaber Supreme Court decision told us that the appellant filed his bill to enjoin the corporation from complying with the income tax provisions of the Tariff Act, the foreign tax. And they tell us that the act provides for collecting the tax at the source. Makes it the duty of corporations, etc., to retain and pay the sum of the tax. That sounds like an indirect tax that is collected by someone and then turned over, what they collect. It's kind of like a sales tax, where the store is actually the taxpayer. The customer comes in, gets his goods, brings them to the counter, the store rings it up, adds on the tax. Either the customer voluntarily pays the sales tax, or he has to leave the store without the goods. There's no gun, there's no force. You know the tax is applied going in. You don't have to pay it. You can leave the goods on the counter and walk out ranting and raving the tax is too high. Make the store put it back on the shelf. If everybody did that, the store owners would complain to Congress. They'd write new law. Maybe. But the store, having collected the tax by adding the cost of the tax onto the cost of the goods, then segregates the tax money collected and has been made liable by law to turn in the tax revenues collected on the sales. They don't pay tax out of their own pocket. They only send in what they've collected from the customers. And that's what's happening in the income tax. Money's being withheld from certain persons, and the collector is the person made liable for sending it in. Let's take a look. We saw that the Bruce-Shaber decisions rejected the direct tax argument, said it's inherently indirect, and said it's nothing but confusion and an erroneous conclusion to believe it's a direct tax, because that would create radical and destructive changes in our constitutional system. Then we saw that the Treasury decision issued Treasury Decision 2313 that said income tax is owed by non-resident aliens who are liable for the tax, whose withholding agents make a report of the non-resident alien's income on Form 1040. The same way a W-2 is used by an employer today. 1040 was the original reporting of taxable earnings report. They changed that in World War II, which we're going to get to in a minute. And then we looked up in the law. We tried to find this definition in the law, this authority in the law, that the court referenced to retain and pay the sum of the tax. And we found the withholding agent defined in 7701A, which is the code section that defines the term person for use throughout the title. So we know that the withholding agent, this definition applies throughout the title. And lo and behold, 1441, 1442, 1443, and 1461 are four code sections that are in Subtitle A, which are chapters 1 through 6 of Title 26. It's the original body of law enacted by Congress in 1913 under the Tariff Act. Subtitle A is the Tariff Act. It's the foreign tax. And look what it provides. The withholding agent means any person required to deduct and withhold under the provisions of sections 1441, 1442, 1443, or 44 code sections. It's as simple a definition as you could have. He's the collector, the withholding agent. He collects from 1441, non-resident aliens. 1442, foreign corporations. 1443, foreign tax-exempt organizations. 1443 and 1461, the employer, every person required to deduct and withhold. The withholding agent, every person required to deduct and withhold, is hereby made liable. And isn't it interesting? They did exactly the same thing 32 years later with the employment tax laws, where they create a new class of tax collectors again, just like they created a new class of tax collectors in 1913, the withholding agents. In 1945, they create a whole new class of tax collectors called employers. And while withholding agents never had any authority to collect the income tax from citizens, employers they get the authority through the back door. They're given an authority to collect tax from anyone who allows it. Any employee who allows it. on a W-4, employees withholding allowance certificate. That's the authority of the employer to collect. Anyone who allows it. The withholding agents had authority only to collect from foreigners for the first 32 years of the tax from 1913 to 1945. And that's all they did. That's why no citizens paid it. That's why anyone alive back then who can remember will tell you nobody paid tax before World War II. Nobody filed. Because it was only collected from citizens and paid by people in the territories and the possessions, or corporate persons or licensed persons. So how did we get from 1913, the taxes imposed on and collected only from foreign persons, to today? Or foreigners are let off and it's only enforced against citizens, as though it were the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. Oh, I'm sorry, it is the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. And your government has been enforcing communism, not constitutional taxation, since the end of World War II. It actually, of course, started during World War II. What was the first time in history that the federal government was able to tax the wages and salaries, the fruits of labor of the American people derived from the simple exercise of the right to work? It wasn't the income tax. It didn't happen in the 1930s. It was the victory tax, 1942. The victory tax, it lasted for 2 years as a temporary war revenue measure. The government attached itself to the wages and the salaries of the American people using the excuse of the need for everyone to patriotically sacrifice to save the world by defeating the Germans in the European theater and the Imperial Japanese in the Pacific theater, which we did. At the end of 1944, when the 2-year war revenue measure fell off the books because the Constitution says any war revenue measure can only last for 2 years, it has to be reenacted by each successive Congress. It has to be refunded. So if the American people don't want to be at war, they can elect a new Congress. They refuse to fund it and bang, the war is over. So it hit the victory tax. It attached itself to the American people's salary. It ran for 2 years. It paid off 90% of the World War II debt. At the end of 1944, the victory tax expired. In 1945, they were marching on Berlin. War was pretty much over. Congress looked around and said, holy smokes, nobody sued. Nobody got upset that we attached ourselves to their wages. We paid off the whole war debt in 2 years. We can't let this power die. But we don't want to write unconstitutional law, so why don't we just write new employment tax code that lets people voluntarily continue to have withholding the same way the victory tax did? We'll just deceive them into doing it by the way we present them with the form. Just tell us that you're single and zero or married or two, and that triggers withholding. Don't ever learn that you should be claiming exempt, so that no one can force you to pay a tax that isn't due until next year, and by doing so impose a condition of involuntary servitude upon your person, which is prohibited by the 13th Amendment. You can't be forced to pay a tax that isn't due until next year. That's why they need your permission to collect it. That's why they ask for your allowance. It's unconstitutional to forcibly take it, because it's not due until next year, to make you service that future obligation before it's actually a legal obligation would be to impose a condition of prohibited servitude, involuntary servitude. So in 1942, they used the victory tax. In 1945, they put employment tax law in place, and we're not going to look at those statutes. You're going to study what happened to the Subtitle A income tax laws and its administration. We'll get to the employment aspect of things later because, as I said, there's no new tax imposed. All they did was create an authority of the employer to collect tax from any employee who allows it. And the employees are indoctrinated with propaganda to believe that the tax they must submit to is the one imposed in 1913. So they just put single and zero when they're 16, married in 4 at age 25, or maybe 29, married in 1 at 25, married in 3, 2, I don't know. So, and then they spend the rest of their lives being slaves to the federal government. And none of the money's actually going into Treasury. It's all going to the Federal Reserve Bank to collateralize the $34 trillion in debt. So, okay, we're going to jump ahead now to 1979. Howard Zaritsky, legislative attorney, American Law Division at the Congressional Research Service. This is the Congressional Research Service in 1979. Some constitutional questions regarding the federal income tax laws. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the whole report. We're just going to jump to the pages that are important. He cites the 16th Amendment as the new provision, and then says in Brushaber versus Union Pacific, the court case we looked at, the Supreme Court held that the income tax, including a tax on dealing in property, was an indirect tax rather than a direct tax. So in 1979, we have the Congressional Research Service, Congress, agreeing with the Supreme Court that this is an indirect tax, not direct. The same view was reiterated by the court in Stanton v. Baltic Mining, which I told you and showed you. And here he cites the section I showed you. 16th Amendment conferred no new power. It doesn't create any powers. It simply prohibited the previous complete and plenary power of income taxation possessed by Congress from the beginning as part of the indirect taxation categories, used as the yardstick, not the function or the object of the subject. It prevents it from being taken out of the category of indirect taxation to which it inherently belongs. And he concludes, therefore, it is clear that the income tax is an indirect tax of the broad category taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. He tries to pretend like taxes is the fourth category. It's not. Taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. That's all there is. There is no fourth undefined category. That doesn't exist. There is no vague defined fourth. That's the quotes from the language, but they're talking about taxes, and here's the list of the three that you get to do. Nothing else is defined. Now, what does the IRS do today? What are they doing? Because what we've seen doesn't seem to agree with what's happening in our society, does it? Oh, well, look, here's the problem. This is from the IRS's frivolous arguments document, where they say all of these things are frivolous. And let's look. Number 6, contention. The 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct non-apportioned federal income tax on United States citizens. That's allegedly the frivolous contention. And here's their argument. Some assert that the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct, non-apportioned income tax, and thus U.S. citizens and residents are not subject to federal income tax laws. So they're saying that some assert this, but it's wrong, but the Supreme Court said it, the Congressional Research says it. And what do they cite? The constitutionality of the 16th Amendment. Well, the 16th is part of the Constitution. Of course it's constitutional. The question is not whether the 16th Amendment is constitutional. The question is whether or not it creates any new powers. And if its use is constitutional, being used the way it is. So the constitutionality of the 16th Amendment has invariably been upheld when challenged. Yeah, right, of course. And numerous courts have both implicitly and explicitly recognized that the 16th Amendment authorizes a non-apportioned direct income tax on United States citizens, and that the federal tax laws as applied are valid. And then they cite United States v. Collins, 10th Circuit. I'm sorry, you cite what? An inferior court to Brushaber? And they say that court cited Brushaber. Yeah, that's right. The Collins appellate court reversed the Brushaber holding. Brushaber says it's indirect. Collins, the socialist judges, the morons, reversed the holding. And now the government doesn't cite the Supreme Court case because it contradicts the assertion. They cite an inferior court. Well, I'm sorry. Why the hell would you go to the horse's ass to get an opinion, the inferior court, when you can go right to the horse's mouth, the Brushaber opinion itself, and read it for yourself? where they tell you this argument that the 16th Amendment creates a direct tax is garbage. Nonsense. It's the frivolous position. It's particularly frivolous when you remember the subject matter jurisdiction lesson, that there has to be an enabling enforcement clause in order for Congress to be constitutionally authorized to write law to enforce this allegedly unlimited new power to tax directly and without limitation. And then they say what? Beckrith in the Ninth Circuit, Collins in the 10th Circuit, Lovell in the 7th Circuit, Broughton in the 8th Circuit, Stearman versus Commissioner in the tax court. These lying pieces of crap don't even cite the Supreme Court decisions. They're using inferior circuit court decisions to allegedly claim they overturned the Supreme Court decision, interpreting it in exactly the opposite of what the Supreme Court said, creating the socialist enforcement of the communist second plank of the manifesto, instead of constitutional taxation by impost, duty, and excise. These socialist perverts, the judges in these cases are perverts and seditionists, attempting to pervert government's entire system of government to social communism. This is the problem. The government is lying to you about the 16th Amendment. Subject matter jurisdiction requires a congressional authority be given to Congress, a constitutional authority be given to Congress to write law. You can show it for impost, duty, and excise in the original necessary and proper enabling enforcement clause. You can't show it for the 16th Amendment because it doesn't exist. And this is how America has been enslaved. Can we find more? Well, first, let's review what happens if we accept this contention, or if we simply examine the way things are today as a result of it. Subject matter jurisdiction of the federal courts to enforce tax law under the U.S. Constitution after the 16th Amendment provides for the federal power of taxation, both as direct and indirect taxation. And you can tax under the 16th Amendment and under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. But Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 only authorizes the excise, the duty, or the impost, which are not affected by the 16th Amendment. And under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, the direct apportion tax is enforced upon the states. But none of these Article 1 powers are enforced under the, all of these powers are enforced under the necessary and proper, the original necessary and proper enabling enforcement clause at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. But none of these enforceable taxes touch the citizen's right to work even after the 16th Amendment. Oh, but look. Are now also allegedly authorized to enforce the direct tax under the 16th Amendment, where the tax is unapportioned without limitation and with no enforcement clause to authorize Congress to write any law to enforce this power of direct taxation under this alleged source of authority. So this is never made enforceable at law by a constitutionally authorized Congress. So no law can legitimately or lawfully be written by Congress to enforce this power against the American people. Only the non-resident aliens subject to its collection in 1913, and only in the territories and possessions, where everyone enjoys the privilege of being protected by the government and thus can be taxed on anything that happens in the territories or possessions. So what's the problem? This is what the IRS administratively enforces, the unenforceable power. They should all be dismissed. Everything, civil and criminal, anything under Title 26 gets dismissed under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 12b1, Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 12b1, and Criminal Procedure 12b2. It's administratively enforced without authority at law ever being properly given to Congress. It's all unenforceable. The whole system is fraud. They're not enforcing constitutional taxation. They're enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. This subject matter jurisdiction diagram analyst is available as part of the Simple Truth About Income Tax for just $4 at irszoom.com if you want to pick yourself up a copy. And so is this next document. Let's take a look at it. Here are the statutes at large from 1939. Now, this is 26 years after the enactment of the 16th Amendment and the income tax laws. So you would think that by 1939, 26 years later, they would accurately have captured in the law the enforceable application of it. 26 years to get the law right. Think they did? I assure you, they did. So let's look at the 1939 law, which at the time was published as Statutes at Large. And what we're going to find is here's the proof that the income tax has always been an indirect tax and has never been a direct tax at all, and that was reflected in the law as late as 1939. Okay, down here, Chapter 1, Income Tax, Subchapter A, Introductory Provisions, Cross-references, Classifications. 4, Special Classes of Taxpayers. The application of the general provisions under Supplements A to D inclusive to each of the following special classes of taxpayers shall be subject to the exceptions and additional provisions found in the supplement applicable to such class as follows. So here we go. These are the classes of persons subject by law to the payment of the income tax. A, estates and trusts and the beneficiaries thereof. B, members of partnerships. C, insurance companies. D, non-resident alien individuals. You remember the non-resident alien individuals the withholding agents are collecting the tax from? Here they are. They're subject to the tax. E, foreign corporations. Remember the foreign corporations subject to the tax under 1442? The withholding agent? Here they are. E, F, individual citizens of any possession of the United States, who are not otherwise citizens of the United States and who are not residents of the United States. So if you're in a possession, you're subject to the tax. G, individual citizens of the United States or domestic corporations, satisfying the conditions of Section 251 by reason of deriving a large portion of the gross income from sources within a possession of the United States. Territories and possessions, non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, and domestic corporations and partnerships. H, China Trade Act corporations, foreign. I, foreign personal holding companies and their shareholders, foreign. J, mutual investment companies, corporate. But where are citizens? Where are citizens? They're not here. This is why nobody paid. The tax didn't reach them. It wasn't imposed on them. It wasn't collected from them. There was no authority in law to collect it from them. The only authority in law to collect it is that of the withholding agent, who's only allowed still to this day to only collect from non-resident aliens. So who are the withholding agents today? Anyone who's not an employer, the banks, the brokers, contracts. Anybody who's not an employer who makes payments is a withholding agent. They don't know their authority today is limited to collecting from non-resident aliens. They illegally take money from citizens all the time because the citizen doesn't know to claim the exemption and tell the bank, you're not my employer. You're a withholding agent, and you only have authority to collect tax from foreign persons. So even if the government asks you to take money from my account, you can't do it. Because I've told you I'm a citizen. I've showed you my passport. I've given you a declaration of citizen that's sworn by a notarized affidavit. I have the withholding agent. Your power to collect tax from me as a bank or a broker or a contractor is gone. It's destroyed. You're not my employer. You're either an employer or a withholding agent to collect tax. Withholding agents collect from foreign persons. Foreign persons. Citizens are outside the authority unless they allow their employer to do it. And then you have the long tables of the surtax on individuals. Notice how they stay away from aliens. Why? It was all done under a Tariff Act, remember? A Tariff Act, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 13. And a tariff is one form of an impost, which is the authority to tax foreign persons. And here they are, non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, possessions, and possessions. Where's citizens in the 50 states? They're not one of the classes of taxpayers. This is the complete list. The law doesn't include that which is not included. It was clear in the 1939 law. And when they recodified it in 1954, they hid all of this from you by moving it to the back of Subtitle A and putting it into sections like 861 instead of right up at front in Section 61, which we're going to look at in a minute, because there's a problem with that one too. So here's the, now, okay, let's look at the tax today. Here I just wanted to put this up so that you see Section 1 is the tax imposed. This should look familiar. Married individuals, fine joint returns. Now, Section 1 was reenacted by Donald Trump in December of 2017, made effective January 2018. So this statute is out of date, but it's still Section 1 tax imposed, and it still looks a lot like this, except the tables aren't right here in this part of the statute. They're in a next subsection of the statute. They're separate now. You have to jump over to them in the next section. The text of the text for married individuals, unmarried, heads of household, that's the same, but it's all right together and the tables are bumped out. But Section 1 is the tax imposed. That's the whole point of this. This is the federal personal income tax that they say you owe. Okay? And they say you owe it because of taxable income, and then they use a definition to try and expand the definition of taxable income to escape the limitation that taxable income is only money earned that's subject to some impost, duty, or excise. Nothing else is taxable to the federal government. Impost, duty, and excise. It's the only powers to tax that are made enforceable at law by a constitutionally authorized Congress. Nothing else. You can't expand sources of taxation beyond impost, duty, and excise subject sources. It doesn't mean gross income minus the deductions. No, taxable income means subject to tax under the Constitution, i.e. an impost, duty, or excise. So here's the first statute they're using to try and deceive you. They're trying to make you believe taxable income is whatever the hell they say it is. Because right down here in adjusted gross income, section 62, they say adjusted gross income is gross income minus the deduction. So in both sections, taxable and gross, you're referred to gross income. And that takes us to section 61, gross income defined. Except as otherwise provided in the subtitle, gross income means all income from whatever source derived. Oh, where have we seen that before? Gee, are we beginning to see the connections? What they're trying to do? Any source. We can tax any source, any source, any source under the 16th Amendment. New power, you're a slave. Shut up and do what you're told. And what's taxable? Compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefits, and similar items. Gross income derived from business. What is it? Impost, duty, or an excise? Impost, duty, or excise. Dealings in property. Impost, duty, or excise. Interest. What? Impost, duty, or excise. Rent, royalties, dividends, annuities. Income, pensions, distributive share, deceit, and what? Impost, duty, or excise. Are they claiming down here in 13, income in respect of a decedent, that they somehow exercised the government-granted privilege in dying? Check. Well, what's not here? What's not here is wages and salaries. The labors of the American people. If they put wages and salaries, the statute would be patently unconstitutional on its face. And they didn't want that. So they removed it. They removed it. Section 61 had an entirely different meaning before 1954 when it was recodified to Section 61. What's the history of this statute? Well, if you look it up in the law at the library, it doesn't tell you if you use the regular law book. You got to go to the United States Code Annotated. The annotated with notes version of the law. When you look up the annotated version of the law, you see that Section 61 has a footnote on it. I don't know why they don't put the footnote in all the versions, but they only put it in the annotated version. But it's incredibly important. It's information being hidden from you. This is lost knowledge. The footnote says the source of Section 61 in the 1954 code is the 1939 code, and it says the statute was brought forward substantially unchanged. Now, I Xeroxed this at the law library. It's not a very good image, but look, here's another image of Section 61 from another law book, and this one actually does cite the source of Section 61 as being the 22A in 1939. So you got two different law books telling you the source of 61 in the 54 code is Section 22A. So let's go look at Section 22A. Gross income. General definition. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, compensation for personal service, including personal service of an officer or employee of any state or political subdivision or any agency or instrumentality of any more of the foregoing. Okay, and then it goes on, professions, vocations, trades, business, commerce, sales, dealings in property, real, and then it goes on, so forth and so on. Interest, rent, dividends, securities. It lists all the things in Section 61, but here in 22, wages and salaries are taxed. Wages and salaries are taxed. Apparently, Section 61, gross income, as Section 62 in 1939, taxed salaries and wages. So how come no citizens paid? How come the law in 39 says it's only non-resident aliens in territories and possessions? Well, let's look a little farther, because they've hidden more from you. You have to search deep into the Code of Federal Regulations to find the implementing table, the implementing regulations for the code section. And what you find is that there is no implementation for Section 61 anywhere in the regular code sections. You have to get to this special little table, 26 USC, from the 1939 code. Section 22, here it is. Remember Section 22? The predecessor to Section 61? And how is Section 22 implemented? Under 26 Part 519. Well, wait a minute. 26 Part 1 is the income tax. Section 40 is implemented under 26 Part 1, the income tax, but that's an alcohol as fuel tax. That's a tax on alcohol being used as fuel. It wasn't added until the 70s with the ethanol programs. But Section 22 is only implemented under 26 Part 519, not Part 1, the income tax, and Section 62 is only implemented under 500 parts. 509, 513, 514, 520, 520. What are these Part 500 parts? Oh, look, the next chapter, subchapter G, shows us that the 500 parts are tax treaties. 501, Australia. 502, Greece. Part 500 is reserved for future use. Who knows what that was, but it's reserved for future use. The 501 Australia, 502 Greece, 503 Germany, 504 Belgium, Netherlands, Japan, United States. Every country has its own part. And remember, Section 22, Section 61 is implemented under 26 Part 519. And Part 519 is Canadian Tax Treaty. In 1918, the United States government signed a 75-year-long tax treaty with Canada. And that's the legislative act that Section 61 originated out of. not the original income tax laws, with gross income being applied to non-resident aliens or citizens. They're taxed on separate items under 1441B. Remember 1441A said collect from non-resident aliens? Well, 1441 lays out the list of sources, just like Section 61 lays out the sources for the Canadian tax treaty. And you've been bamboozled, deceived, defrauded, and lied to make you believe that Section 61 applies to you to make you a slave. Everything you do is taxable because of the source. But this legislative investigation shows that Section 61 never applied to domestic income. It doesn't apply now because the tax treaty with Canada that it did apply to expired in 1993 under Bill Clinton when it was replaced with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that eliminated all taxation between the two countries, the three countries trade, Mexico, North America, and US. And when the tax treaty expired and was replaced with NAFTA, Section 61 expired too. It's dead letter law. It's still on the books, but it has no valid legislative application because the original act expired. It was enacted with a timetable, a drop-dead timeline. And when the drop-dead timeline comes up, all the statutes enacted under the treaty also expire with it. Unless the statute was reenacted at some intervening time by Congress with further authority than that provided under the original legislation. That has never happened. Section 61 has never been published. It's been dead letter law for over 30 years. It cannot be used in court to show that gross income applies to citizens in the states. It only applied to an expired Canadian tax treaty. It was never made applicable within Part 1. Only Part 519, and adjusted gross income only applies to treaties with Switzerland, Ireland, 14, France, 20, Sweden, 21, Denmark. There's the table, 13, 14, 19. Now, if you're looking up this table today, 519 is reserved for future use, just like Part 500, because there is no Canadian tax treaty, it's expired. So 519 is no longer listed as being Canadian because it's reserved because the treaty expired. And then we have this article that explains everything, how this was used in court to basically defeat the DOJ on the argument. It shows again the law, the new 86 law. They recodified the law again in 1986 after 1954. You actually had three recodifications, 39, 54, and 86. Here's the version of the law on every single one. And we traced the statute's evolution through these recodifications of the law. Recodification is when the government has passed so many more new laws, it becomes necessary to kind of reorganize them and maybe relist them so that when an attorney needs information about a law, he can go to a specific title and have all the laws, including the new ones, all right there, properly organized into the places where they should be. So they had law statutes at large in 39. They recodified it into the United States Code. 54, and then recodified in 86, and then of course they passed a new tax law in 2017 under Trump, and that had to be integrated into the statutes as well. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at that in a minute. Okay, so again, here's the listing in the table, 26 USC 1939. Can we zoom in on that a little bit maybe? Where's the one? Here it is. Right? I guess I got to go out one. I moved it off the ring. You can see that, right? 22, 26, Part 519, Section 40 is Part 1, the income tax. It's the alcohol fuel tax. Part 519, not Part 1. And Section 62, adjusted gross income, is all foreign treaties. That has no domestic application either. So you can see the government is either intentionally lying to you or they're just basically complete and total idiots. Don't understand how the law works or how to use it. I mean, that's just perfectly clear, isn't it? here it is. I did this. I'm not an attorney. I went to the law library. I pulled the books. I pulled out the fiche. You got to go to microfiche to get to 2013 and 2018 to find these statutes in that version of law. You can't find Section 22 before 2020. It came into law before 1920. It came into law in 1918. It took them a whole year to get it into the statute. Here's the first time in 1920. Limited application on the tax treaty signed in 2018. It wasn't even part of the original legislation. There's no application to gross income domestically. None whatsoever. And here again, we see the article. I think this is out of place, this page. Well, let it go. So we see here again from the article that explains it, Section 22 is listed under 26.519, which is the Canadian tax treaty. And here the article shows you how 515 through 519 are all now reserved for use. Here are the treaties still in play, and here are the ones that are out. Okay, so looks like we've got a substantially different historical application of the tax than what the government is enforcing on the American people. So let's stop here and we'll come back and do a part 3 in just a bit. Again, this is Thomas Freed. This information is over at taxfreedom.com. You can get help dealing with IRS correspondence at irszoom.com. I urge everyone, if you're interested in this, want a copy of these documents, to pick yourself up a copy of The Simple Truth About Income Tax for $4. And I'm going to put this whole exhibit binder on sale too for like 20 bucks when I get to it, which should be pretty soon, but I'm going to finish making these YouTube videos first. So I'll be back with part 3 in the next video on the YouTube channel at Tax Freedom. That's with a hyphen. At Tax Freedom, just like the website, tax-freedom. Okay, guys, Thomas Freed. We'll be back. You don't know where it's going. Nah, nah. Bombasticide. Hit me with the head, baby. With the bread. Now what the fuck are we supposed to do? We just got nailed by our own shit. And you see what I see. Too late for you. Must not have parked in a safe place, huh? Oh, baby, what'll it be? I don't know. Walking along that river, sweep on by. It just keep on flowing, where it's going. Nah, nah. about how people who play music and make music are called musicians, not magician. She doesn't think. she doesn't. She doesn't think is the only thing she said that was correct. Only thing she said that is correct. Certainly not a magician. Often says things that he has no idea what anybody's talking about. Often says things that nobody has any idea at all that he's talking about. I have no idea. Nobody knows. He just talks all the time about shit nobody knows what he's talking about. Nobody knows. Not our fault. Around. Nothing about you stands on its own. Nothing. Going for the win. A lying fuck. Well, a lying fuck. Yeah.
Actual think of this, it's not necessary in this context. It's divisive. There's one national anthem for every American. There is no point actually and to those who love each other. To try to divide by race when we get to anthems at the Super.
Right now or tomorrow, help me hang this. I have to go on the wall, the toilet room behind the door. Is to hang a bath towel on. Who's Bobby? Food in here. You think the food? With the tube. You have in there. Cool.
Have a screwdriver there?
Try this.
going on?